we go.
Hello, and welcome to our June webinar as part of our 2021 webinar series. This is Division 34 of the American Psychological Association. We are the Society for Environmental, Population, and Conservation Psychology. My name is Daniel Benkendorf. I am the current president of Division 34. And for our June installment of our webinar series, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Janet Swim, who's professor of psychology at the Pennsylvania State University. She received her BA from Hope College and her PhD in social psychology from the University of Minnesota. And she's an elected member of the Board of Scientific Affairs for APA. She chaired APA's task force on psychological perspectives on climate change. She's a past president of Division 34 and has worked with the United Nations to include psychological research in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Review of Research. She has also served on several committees at Penn State to facilitate interdisciplinary research related to sustainability and promote sustainable behavior on campus. She researches climate action in terms of public engagement via civic engagement, science education, desire to address climate injustice, and psychological processes that facilitate and that hinder caring for the planet. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Swim today.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here. Do you want to continue? I do want to continue. Sorry, my screen is just saying something to me. Anyways, so let me put my slide up here and make sure that it still works okay. All right.
Good.
Okay, now I've lost my chat. Okay, yeah, so thank you. Yes, I'm really pleased to be here. It's been a nice set of series that you've all put together, and I look forward to actually hearing some of them also on tape that are recorded. And so what I want to talk about today is something if you were on back before, I gave this talk, a version of this talk at Backroom, so you can see what changes might be there or different depending on what you saw then or not. But I want to talk about policies in the sense that there has been a lot of increase in interest of moving towards something that has system changes. And so policies are one of those places of system change. And so I'm going to talk about some of the research that Nathan Geiger is a collaborator on this and some of my other students. So Joe Guerriero will be also one of his studies. So I'm going to talk about two studies that we've done. But before I start, I want to start with something that as a contrast to what I'm doing. And so the contrast is something that I was struck by years and years ago. When I first started doing research on climate change, I was able to bring in speakers to Penn State. And my first speaker was John Krosnick. And so this is about a decade or so ago. And I was really struck by some of the data he had. So he does a lot of political attitude research and polling research. And he's one of the first people to do research on attitudes about climate change. And what struck me is one of his first slides that he put up. And so what his slide was one of this data set, and I've updated it to 2020. And so he said, so what percent of Americans will believe Earth's temperature has probably been increasing over the past 100 years? And so he presented this data, and the results are about 80%. And what's striking to me is that it's been a constant 80%-ish. There's dips here and there, but most people have believed this, and they've believed it since 1998. So they've been pretty certain, I know certain is a different word, but they've been pretty much endorsing this. Most people are endorsing that. And so you move forward and you get more data. He's got a lot of data like that. And so he's got a lot of data over time. But then even you look now, you get what percent is it say it's happening. And so the more yellow the bar, the yellow to red, the more they're saying it. So you get a large percent of people saying it's happening, a large percent saying they're worried, a large percent say that it's great to moderate harm to future generations. And then when you even go to policies, what you find is that most people support efforts to address climate change. So again, the colors here, most people want to regulate CO2 as a pollutant. they support a carbon tax. They're in favor of requiring utilities to present 20% of the renewables. So most people are in favor of all these things. And so what's striking to me is this, in some sense, this constancy of favorable attitudes, if you would say, towards doing something about climate change or concern about climate change. But we end up spending a lot of time to try and convince people of something they already believe. So most of the people already believe the things that we want them to believe, in a sense of getting them to the position where they would want to do something about climate change, because those beliefs are correlated with doing something about climate change. So we spend a lot of time on that. But what I wanted to say, so if we got all that support, why do we struggle in enacting policies? And so that's where I was moving from and thinking about that. And we move to these sorts of answers that climate change is an unobtrusive distal problem. So it's something that when we think about it, yeah, it's important, but it's farther away. Some people have argued that climate change lacks a moral imperative, since people have been trying to make it more important morally. And then there's political polarization. And so all of those reasons are credible and reasons for it. And there's a lot of research to support that, in the sense those things support not doing something in action. And I want to say, though, that these individual level explanations represent only part of the puzzle. And so in psychology, we do a lot of things about individual differences. And so it's not surprising we get into those sort of answers to why we aren't getting policy support. But I want to talk about some other way of looking at policy support. And to give an example, so here's just to remind you all, I'm sure you all know that we've got our red states and our blue states, and this is as defined by the 2020 election. But when you look at the carbon pricing, you see that it is mostly in the blue states, but certainly not all of the blue states. So you find that only on the far ends of the country are they supporting carbon pricing. And so there are several blue states even that are not supporting carbon pricing. Then we can look at another one, electricity portfolio standards. That's again like 20% required from renewables, which we knew that from the previous data most people support. And when we look at this, we get most of the states doing it. So we get a lot of the red states are doing that. So what I wanted to be thinking about here is, in some sense, what's the difference between this? It's not political polarization. The attitudes are relatively constant across the country. And so there's a question then is, what is the difference between like the cap and trade policy and the energy portfolio standard? So why is it that we get this difference? And so to think about it, there are a lot of policies that we could possibly promote. And so there's lots of different target areas here that we can look at. So this is from Drawdown. Drawdown has 100 different things we can do. These are the top sort of things we can do. We can reduce our food consumption. We can do education, health and education. We can eat more plant-rich diets. So all of these things are possible places where we could have policies. And there are policies actually proposed for many of these. And so thinking about not necessarily who's supporting what and what are the differences between those people who support it or not, but what are the differences between how people perceive some of these policies? And so why are some policies preferred over other policies? So this is, I said I was going to present two studies, and so this is the first study that I'm going to present. This actually builds out of two studies, the references down there. But so the question is, why are we preferring some policies over other policies? So this is a within person analysis as opposed to between person. So this is going beyond, for instance, the political polarization, which is a between person analysis. So what attributes make one policy more appealing than another policy, and why do those attributes matter? So that's the point of these studies. So what we did was we wanted to then predict preferences among policies. And you can go to the web and I'll show you some things and find polls. So I'll show you an example of a couple of policies, but it's they often are confounding many different types of attributes. And what we did is we selected 3 particular attributes that we thought would make a difference in terms of whether or not people would support them or not. So one attribute is, how are the policies trying to create change? In other words, who is the policy trying to change? And what change are the policies targeting? So we have 2 MTurk studies up here. They're all a 2x2x2 with in-person design. And that's based upon the how, who, and what. So I'm going to go through the how, who, and what just to make sure that's clear and why we're selecting them. So the how is, how are we trying to get people to change? One of the most frequently studied areas, and this one is incentives versus disincentives. And there are studies that have looked at this. And so generally people prefer carrot over sticks. And so another way is push versus pull. Incentives versus disincentives. So the carrot's the incentive and the stick is the disincentive. So the pull is the carrot, the push is the stick. So lots of research, not lots, but there is research that says that people like policies with incentives over disincentives, and particularly climate change policies or energy policies. The who then is targeting businesses versus individuals. So you can think about energy efficient buildings in people's homes, or you can think about them in a major building. So there are 2 different targets. You can give rebates for the home, you can give rebates for businesses. In a sense, you can have, that would be an incentive policy for both of them. So who, and so here's an example from polls comparing them. The percent of Americans who thought the federal government should require companies to pay tax for every ton of greenhouse gas they emit from imported coal. So it's targeting companies and their gases that they're using, the greenhouse gases, heat trapping gases. And so the other one is percent of Americans who believe that the US government should increase taxes on electricity to cause people to use less. So these policies differ in 2 different ways, but they're both trying to get people to change their behavior by, in a sense, disincentives. And so when you have it here, people don't like them, disincentives for individuals, but they prefer it more when it's disincentives for businesses. Now, again, there's differences between these 2, but it is that difference you see in this preference. But if you go over to this one, you see that instead of disincentives, they're using incentives. So on the left side, it's percent of Americans who believe the US government should give companies tax breaks to produce electricity. So that's tax breaks. And on the right, it's rebates for individuals to put solar panels on their homes. And so in this case, you still get a little bit more for businesses than individuals, but it's much more similar. And so who people target may matter by how you target them as well. And so there's the who and the how together. Then we have the what, supply versus demand. So that's kind of been embedded in those other questions. So you can focus on solar panels, for instance. You can focus on where our energy comes from. So we can either increase the amount of renewable energy or decrease the amount of fossil fuel energy. But it's about changing the energy supply. And some people might call that upstream sorts of changes. Then there's the more downstream, which is the demand, energy demand. So that's the efficiency sort of thing. So when you have energy efficiency, you're trying to use less energy as opposed to change the supply of energy itself, the energy that you use, the composition of the energy to have more renewables and less fossil fuels. So, so we were comparing those 2 things. And I mentioned upstream and downstream. There's some literature that says that people prefer upstream sorts of policies. In some sense, that's more of a system change than downstream policies. And that was a study on in airline use. Anyways, so supply versus demand. So what we did then is we unconfounded a whole bunch of different things that were together in other people's polls and unconfound other things in terms of sorts of policies you might get. So we have this 2x2x2. Is it incentive or disincentive? Is it business or individuals? And is it supply or demand? So, so incentives in businesses, grants to develop renewable energy power plants. So that is changing the supply to be more renewable. targeting energy power plants, and using incentives with grants. And so you can go through each of these and you get a different sort of plan. So clean power plans, you tax emissions from power plants. So we gave people these labels, but we also gave them about 2, maybe 3 sentences description of each one of these policies. And we had them rate these policies to see which ones they preferred over the other policy. And so it's trying to find out which ones are these characteristics predicting whether or not people will support the policies. And so we do find that, like others have found it, people like incentive policies over disincentive policies. They prefer to target businesses over individuals, and they prefer to target supply over demand. But there is also that interaction that I alluded to. So when you have incentives versus disincentives, the business versus individuals matter. So when it's incentives, it depends it's basically not a difference. And when you look at the 2 different studies, when it's incentives, they're pretty much saying it's quite similar. The bigger difference comes when you look at disincentives. They prefer to have the disincentives given to businesses rather than individuals. There is a main effect for incentives and disincentives across each one of them. So they prefer incentives for businesses than disincentives, and incentives for individuals versus disincentives. But the biggest difference is in the disincentive for targeting visit. They would rather have the disincentives go to the businesses and not the individuals. And so the next question is, why do these attributes predict policy support? And so what we move to here is looking at the anticipated consequences of the different policies. And so if you go through, you can see some of these things that people talk about when they talk about climate change policies. And so these are some things that objections to policies that have been raised. So one is like an economic objection. And so this is a sign that you can see in Western Pennsylvania, Obama's no job zone. And so it's the coal lobby is putting these things up and saying that you're going to lose your job. So there are economic objections to it. There are also some social objections. So this is one that says how climate change panic costs us trillions, hurts the poor, and fails to fix the planet. So, so those are objections and saying that these things, these policies actually are going to hurt the poor. But on the other side, you can see the same thing. Sort of Citizens Climate Lobby that has a fee and dividend is their the policy that they would like to promote. So you charge a fee, and the money from that becomes a dividend to the rest of the population. So you give money back. And so one of the things they say, it's effective. We could be net zero by 2020. That's something from the webpage. That's passed. But you could see net zero by a certain date. Soon is what they're saying. It'll be effective. You could have money is in your pocket. That's the dividend. We can have a stronger economy, people spending that money. We can keep businesses healthy. They make this argument. It creates jobs. It saves lives. So there's some sort of social component, creating jobs being both economic and social. So you can see that these are the sorts of arguments that people are making. And so we talked about this and thought about them in terms of the 3 pillars of sustainability, which you might see that I was alluding to by the way I labeled those arguments. That's a good question. We have social, economic, and environmental. So what we asked people was, we asked them questions about to what extent does it benefit people, to what extent does it harm people, and we took the difference between those to get net positive social impacts. And then we get the difference between benefits to the economy and harms to the economy. That's the net harm, net economic benefits. And we had extent to which it benefits the environment. So we call that an effectiveness policy. We had in there harms to the environment, but so few people said it created some skewness in the data. And so we just went to the benefits of the environment. I'll say that Nathan has done a lot of work on this part of the studies that we've done, and to demonstrate that our measures actually seem to form these 3 different ideas when you look at them in terms of policy support, with the within policy support. So what? So the what part of it is when you look at the supply versus demand, that they think the supply is going to have more benefits, which we're calling effectiveness. They're going to have more positive social impacts, and then we're going to have more economic impacts, positive economic impacts. And when you do the mediation model, you find that supply, like I just said, supply is more effective. Supply is more economic impact, supply is more social impact, and these three things then are correlated with policy support, and they do have indirect effects. So people's assessments of what they think the impacts are going to be can explain why they prefer the supply over the demand policy. Not out of my bank account is what I'm calling this, or we're calling this in the sense that I don't know if I mentioned that before. It's in some sense, it's that it's okay to like do disincentives with businesses, but not for individuals. That's why it's not out of my bank account, take it out of the business's bank account. But we find that with environmental benefits, it follows the same pattern as the support for the policies. So a little difference in the incentives, but they think the disincentives will be more effective with businesses than individuals. And similarly, social impacts are similar for incentives, but the biggest difference is that they think it would have more positive social impacts for businesses. It's pretty neutral here, so it's, because there are different scores. So 0 is the neutral point. And then when you look at the mediation model, this is a moderated mediation. So comparing businesses versus individuals for incentives, it's a slight difference here on the effectiveness for environmental benefits, but it's much bigger when it's disincentives. And for net social impact, it's actually a negative path for when it's an incentive, that it's slightly better for people, but for disincentives is where the largest impact is. Now, economic impacts it's not part of the moderated mediation. It does mediate it in the sense that people think the incentives are better for the economy, and that then explains why they support the policy. But in terms of the NOMBA sort of effect, or that interaction we had, it's the environmental effect and the positive social impacts. So some summary and some questions to think about, which I think is in some sense related to the Dahlia's question, the question zone. So I'll try and connect that with it. So to summarize, people prefer supply over demand. And so what I think about when I see that is to think about what is the implications of this for our behavioral change research. That mostly, at least historically, has focused on demand reduction. So when we're trying to change people's behaviors to use less energy, then that's reducing demand. And we have a lot more research on that than supply. And so when I think about that, I think people aren't going to like those as much. They're going to like the policies that are more likely to be changing supply over demand. How and who, so prefer incentives to disincentives, prefer incentives to disincentives, especially if the target is an individual. And so one of the things I've thought about with this is I wonder whether these sort of effects are reflecting the idea that people don't really want to change. So if you have a demand and you have to do something to reduce your energy, you have to invest in some sort of energy efficiency, or you have to do something less. But supply, if you change the supply, you don't have to change anything. You can continue to do whatever you want to do. And with incentives, you can choose to have an incentive or not. But with a disincentive and you don't do something, then you get penalized with it. So there's some sense there's a greater force for disincentives. And so my skeptical mind says that people like the incentives because then they don't have to do anything. They can choose not to do it, or they can choose to get a reward. With a disincentive, you're forced to either have a penalty or not do it. So I'm wondering how much of this is like status quo maintenance, or they don't have to do anything. And so this is where I get to the question here. So what we find, we did look at political identity, and there's basically no interactions. And so no interactions in the predicting of support for the policies, or no interactions in the relationships between the in the past in those mediation models. And so there is, in the first study we did get interaction with political identity, but it wasn't replicated in the second one. And I think that's somewhat related to Belia's question here, that she asked, I wonder if the data is broken down by people's occupations, managers, executives. In other words, the difference is based on social class or occupations. I was thinking about the interaction that was in one study, but not the second, is that for the incentives by who effect, it is stronger the more liberal you are, and the more Republican you are, that interaction is weaker. It's still there and it's still significant. And so people prefer, particularly if you get to the disincentive part, people prefer disincentives to businesses, to individuals, but that difference is greater if you're a liberal than if you're a conservative. And we didn't replicate it in the second study. So part of what I'm thinking is based upon the question that you have listed there for occupations. If you own a business, you might take this differently. Or if you're like the executive of a business, you might perceive it more like an individual, and you wouldn't like the disincentives. So that difference between disincentives, well, between business versus individuals, I think it could be there. And we didn't look at that. We don't have that data to look at it, but that would be my prediction. Yet I would still point to the possibility that it's still there. And that's my point at the bottom of it. It's sort of a benefit of focusing on the policies, not people. In a sense, when I mean by people, not the hurting or harming people, not the social impacts, but not differences between people. So when we have people focus on the policies and what they like or dislike about the policy, then people are taking a very specific view of those policies. And that gives you a different sense. It separates you away from this political polarization to some extent, and that we don't even get a main effect for political identity. I think it's a marginal effect in one study. So political identity doesn't predict support or not lack of support for these policies. And I think it's because when you look at each one individually, people are thinking about them. And when we did this study, a lot of the comments actually were, thanks for telling me this. I didn't realize there were so many policies that we could be thinking about. So that was the sort of reaction we got, is to get people to focus on the policies themselves. I think there probably are some things that might make you independent of, that might affect how you see supply versus demand, but I think it's really trying to get at what is it about these policies that we like or dislike. And so, and I say this because I think we're at a point to some extent where there's resistance to some policies, any policies, I mean, but we're moving to a point where we're looking at which policies are people willing to accept more than others. And so can we make the policies more acceptable, either by selecting particular policies or understanding why people are objecting to the policies based upon characteristics of the policy, rather than necessarily characteristics of the people per se. I don't know if that gets at what you're asking about. Yeah. So that's the first study. Actually, I forgot I put this part in here. So I think there are other questions you can ask as well. So we have who, what, and how. You could break down the who more. You could say in groups versus out groups, for instance, not just businesses versus individuals. And so you could have different who's. The what, you could break down the what's farther. So when the supply, we had both changing renewables, increasing renewables and decreasing fossil fuels. And we didn't find those differ, but there are other attributes of businesses you could think about. Where is we have a fair amount of research on the NIMBY effect, not in my backyard. So I think that fits into it. When, now versus later. Why is like what sort of explanations do you give to it? How is what we've studied before. So I guess what I'm saying with these questions, not just that they're possible variables, but I think when people are approaching something, they may be thinking about it just like a journalist might be thinking about it. And they're thinking about these things. Well, who is it going to affect? You know, who's going to have to pay? What is it? Where is it going to be? When is it going to happen? Why do we need this? And how is it going to be implemented? So I think when you think about people looking at policies, then they maybe start thinking about the policies and what questions people might be asking. And I think that we focused on people's, in a sense, cognitive assessments, their anticipated impacts. We didn't focus on their emotional responses to them. I think that we could move into some of that. So when people think about the impacts that the different policies will they have, are they hopeful, which I think would probably be related to effectiveness. Are they worried about them? Are they angry about them? Are they bored by them? Which I think is an important thing as well, is that people just might not really care. But the anger and worry, in some sense, it'd be if it's a policy, if you object to the policy, you might be angry about the policy. You might be angry about disincentives. Or you may say, why are individuals being targeted? Why isn't the business is being targeted? So I think some emotional responses would be an important thing to look at. So I'm going to pause here before I get to the next one. And so I've got a second study, but I want to see whether there's other questions that people want to ask.
Yeah, Jen, I don't see other questions at the moment, but yeah, I just wanted to reiterate, if you do have questions, folks listening, you can just pop them into the chat, or if you can figure out the Q&A, you can put it there as well. And you can do that at any point. And if hopefully we'll have some time at the end as well.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so I would like to think about what is the implication for the research that we as psychologists are doing with this. Okay, so the next study is one that Nathan and Joe and I have worked on in NOMBA. So basically, if you see not out of my bank account is a problem, which is what the previous research suggests when people don't like take it out of businesses, don't take it out of me, use disincentives for them. But there's a NOMBA is also relevant in the sense of who's going to pay for something. So if you have a community solar panels, who's going to pay to put the community solar? And I say that because we had that in our area, that our county was putting in community solar panels, and we had the county commissioners had a meeting about it, and people wanted to say, well, how are you going to pay for that? Is that coming out of our taxes? Who's going to pay for this community solar? And it's also the case that it was actually something that was considered at Penn State as well, is that there was a period where universities were charging green fees for students to be able to implement some of the sustainability programs that they have. And it's possible you could also do like students helping fund solar panels on campus, for instance. So and so that would be who's going to pay for it. Am I going to pay for it, or is somebody else going to pay for it, sort of thing. So it's not out of my bank account. And so people we would predict from people's dislike of things. Okay, so yes. So Pat, we'll get to that. So first we predict people don't like it if they have to pay for it. But I think that one of the things we thought was interesting is it might actually provide some sort of opportunity. And so when I'm saying people are paying attention to policies, when we've asked them to think about different types of policies. So if something is costing you something, it may increase your attention to it, attention to the information that's given to you. And it's an opportunity because at that point, you might be able to give them some sort of science messages to use to promote the policies, or any sort of messages. But we focused on science messages, in that science messages people may find are too difficult to understand. And so they may back away, and they might not listen to what you have to say. in general. And so those science messages like information deficit models might not matter. But on the other hand, it could matter if people have some sense of paying attention to what you're saying and how, if you say it well. But that might be mostly when it's something that you have to pay for. So we get that out of the dual process models of persuasion. And the idea here is that when you are motivated, you will pay attention to a message. If you're not motivated, you're not going to pay attention to the message as well. And so it's when you're motivated is you're going to pay attention to the content of the message. And so these science messages might be really important when you're motivated. So that was what we're thinking about going into it, is applying the sort of dual process model of persuasion to think about how does that affect people's policy support. So what we did, we had people in one of two conditions. So the university has policies requiring exams. So this is past research, I guess I'm saying. This is where outcome relevance in the dual process models. What they did was university as a policy is requiring exams to graduate now makes that policy outcome relevant. So that's the historical research. And when you have students thinking about things where either they will have to take this exam, it's outcome relevant. That's different than saying somebody 10 years after you was going to have to take an exam. And so that's how they manipulated outcome relevance. And we're saying that NOMBA, not out of my bank account, makes it outcome relevant. So if it's out of your bank account, it matters. If it's out of somebody else's bank account, it doesn't matter. So what we were looking at then is first, is that the case? So what we had was that people were told about community solar fees. And they were told that this is at Penn State and you're going to potentially have to pay for this, these community solar panels. Or we told them there's these fitness clubs in California, they're going to put in community solar panels and their members of their community are going to need to pay for this. Do you think this is a good policy? Would you support this policy? And what we find is that if it's Penn State students, they don't really, they're neutral on it basically. But if it's the same sort of policy where people who are using the energy have to pay for it, members and students being similar in that sense, they're fine. Yeah, they should pay for it. But if it was me, I wouldn't want to pay for it. So then we gave them what we call weak science tactics. These are tactics that is kind of a general thing that people say. So the world was getting warmer. So I call that a weak science tactic in part because if you remember back to the very beginning, is people already think this is the case. So you're not informing them of something they don't already believe. And they say polar bears are dying. And so these are animal effects and distal animal effects. And then people say, we need renewable energy. And so that's a sort of message it's not atypical. And it's not a bad message, but it's not necessarily the strongest message that you could give. And this becomes important because in terms of dual process models, what dual process models argue is that you can tell whether or not people are thinking deeply about what you're saying is if they can identify or they're more persuaded by stronger arguments than weaker arguments. So we're saying that if it's a weak science tactic, they probably are not going to be as persuaded than a strong tactic, but only if it's relevant, because that's when they're going to notice that that's kind of a weak tactic. So that's what we have, is when it's a weak tactic, you basically get the same effect as if you hadn't given them any message at all. And then we contrast those weak tactics with strong tactics. And strong tactics, this comes out of the work that I did with, Nathan and I did with frameworks. And we worked at zoos and aquariums to construct educational messages that would engage the audience and help them understand the science. So we're calling these strong science tactics. And so you start your message with a value that matches your audience's value. Responsible management of our resources to protect the future is something that tends to go across political parties. And so that is a value that's likely to match most audiences. So that's a value message. You start with that. You don't start with the planet's melting and everything's going to go bad. You start with something that they value and they want to keep in some sense. And then you can present the science, and you can present the science in ways, not just the temperature's getting bigger, but you use metaphors to explain it. So we use heat trapping gases rather than greenhouse gases, because that's a metaphor that people tend to understand better. Understand when you have a blanket around the planet, it keeps the planet warm, and carbon dioxide is thickening that blanket and it's getting warmer and warmer. They understand that better than greenhouse effect. There's lots of other associations people have with greenhouse. So use metaphors that work, and you use explanatory chains. So you explain how fossil fuels are thickening that blanket, creating a warmer temperature. And so it's explanatory chain between the fossil fuels and the climate change temperature warming, and connecting it to impacts. And so the chain goes from the causes to the problem by way of how the science happens, what is causing it. And so then you get these impacts, and instead of polar bears somewhere else, this is a more debated category of whether it works or not, but people have argued that if it's local impacts, not somewhere out with polar bears in the North Pole, and if you talk about human health. And so we can talk about whether or not that works better or not, but the idea is to give them something they don't normally think about, it because people's default tends to be it's somewhere else. And so you think about things that are not their default, and think about human health. So that's social side of impact. And then you connect that to the solution. And when you get to the solution of the renewable panels, for instance, renewable solar panels, solar energy. So when you get to those solutions, you tie it back to the science. And so you tie it back to, because you're not burning fossil fuels. And so you make that connection. And the idea is to give community level responses. So the community solar panels is in the sense we're doing this together. So that's the strong message. And when, so responsible management is the value, regular and rampant CO2. So that's a different, so that's one of the metaphors. Heat trapping blanket is another metaphor we use. We talk about disease and spreading with insects, and how it gets warmer and the insects survive. And we get the system level solutions with solar panels, which then decreases rampant CO2. So that's basically the sort of message. And what we find then is that in our pilot study here, we found that when you do that, then students were saying, okay, maybe we should pay something. So you get the policy support when you got the strong message. And that again is important, and is for connecting it to the dual process model. So the dual process model was that you will find a difference between stronger and weaker messages when it's relevant. Otherwise, people are using something else to make their decisions, loosely connected to your message. But the message content becomes much more important when it's relevant. So that was the pilot study. On our main study, what we added in was we looked at how favorable are their thoughts. And so this is because when you go into the dual process models, it's also the reason why it's relevant matters is that they think more about it. They're paying more attention to it. And so you can see that in the thoughts that they generate. So in this case, in the second study, we have that they are the number, or not the number, but the favorability of their thoughts is stronger when you have a strong message than when you have a weak message. It's not when it's out in California, when that sense it's irrelevant. The messages are pretty well similar in terms of the number of favorability of the thoughts. It's when you get over here is when you get that favorability of thought matters in the relevant condition. And then a mediation model. And so this is again a conditional mediation. When you have strong tactics versus weak tactics, and it's irrelevant, it doesn't affect the favorability of thoughts. When it is relevant, it does affect them, which is what the graph I just showed you. And those thoughts then predict policy support, and there's an indirect effect here. Sorry, indirect effect at the top. So the indirect effect occurs when it's relevant. There are a whole bunch of qualifications on this study, but this is the main thing. So summary with this is NOMBA, like NIMBA, reduces support, is what we thought, even among those who have relatively strong climate change beliefs. So that's the student population, is that when you look at them and we assess their beliefs at the end, they say they believe that climate change is a problem, we should do something about it. And so we have a sample, kind of like the rest of the United States, that matters. And so we're looking at these policies people don't tend to like, and we find that sort of NOMBA effect. But we can reduce that. So we can reduce that effect by giving them strong tactics when it's relevant. And so it becomes really important in the messages that you give when it's relevant. What we were interested in thinking about is expanding the boundary conditions. So how much or how little money matters. So if it's only a dime, people probably don't care. And then they might not process it, but they'll say, fine, I can give you a dime. But if it's, $200 or $1,000, they'll say, no, that's just too much. And so it doesn't matter. And so there's this kind of sweet spot that I think is an important thing to think about in terms of the NOMBA effect. So that and in terms of how much people pay attention to the messages. So there are other parts of the message feature that seem to create some complications in our message. The way we described it was that in the main study, for reasons I can go into if you want, but we had them have people from either the fitness club or from Penn State say that they were in favor of it in both the weak and strong conditions. And so we got the weak condition had a bit more of a tendency to support it. And we think one of the things that's going on is some sort of social validation is occurring as well. So the point being is that there are other message features besides science that matter. And social validation is another possible message quality that could matter. And when you're thinking about what is the message qualities that matter when you get people to are paying attention versus those that don't matter, or when they're not paying attention. And the other thing, the boundary condition, you have to have both ability and motivation to process it. So the science message was not really that technical. It's set up to be easy enough. So there's some boundary conditions that would make our findings generalizable or not generalizable. And one of the things we're interested in is what is the long-term consequences? So theoretically, when you're thinking more deeply about something, you are going to have your attitude will be stronger, it will last longer, it will then be perhaps more resistance to other messages. So if people are paying attention to the science message and they have these favorable thoughts, it might in some sense better inoculate them to when other people start countering them. So that's possible that these sort of conditions, while it seems to reduce support, actually again is some sort of opportunity to be thinking about. But in general, I'd like to go back to how I started, is that one of the things here is that this is getting into when you're thinking about a particular policy, and even amongst states that don't support things when you think they would, then maybe that's the opportunity for or it's an opportunity, but it's also a requirement then when people are paying attention to give them information that matters to them that they can understand. And again, it's a focus on the policies themselves and the arguments you're using for particular policies. So this glass half full or half empty. So looking across them, so most people believe humans are causing climate change and something should be done about it. And another positive part is people will pay attention with the right circumstances. And so you might be able to think about particular policies that will draw people's attention in. And making policy adjustments may be easier than changing people. And I think that's kind of an interesting question. So if we spend all our time trying to convince people who don't think climate change is a problem to change their beliefs, it could be harder. It might be easier to try and figure out, well, what can we do to this policy that satisfies more people? So back to questions. I can see Pat's question here. So I'm quite curious about the gap between preferences and actual effectiveness. Yes, that's a really good question. So yes, I think that's an excellent question. And I've thought about that. Is so if you're a policymaker and you're trying to decide, should I use incentives or disincentives? And you might say, I'll use incentives because I can get this policy passed and people will like it. And that's back to that status quo thing. Well, you give them the incentive to decide they don't want the incentive and they don't do it. And so if you want to make a change, the disincentives might actually be the thing you might want to do. So you get this sort of trap between, people like this policy better, but it doesn't work as well. And so I think that's a really interesting dilemma. But I think our research, in some sense, gets at that idea. And that's what I was trying to talk about in terms of if people like these policies because they don't have to do anything, then that's not really a great policy. So any other questions?
Yeah, so while we wait for folks to maybe type in some more questions, I had one thought that I'll just raise here while we're waiting, and that's that. So in your research, you're asking the participants to carefully consider these policies, but it seems like in outside of the lab or outside of research, people are not necessarily considering the details of policies or deliberating very carefully about policies in most instances. And so it seems like one of the challenges is to really, how do we get people to go beyond maybe their political. I thought your finding about political identity was really fascinating, that it just didn't really matter as much as we think it does. But I'm wondering, how do we get people to start thinking carefully about policies so that we can use some of these techniques maybe to garner support? I'm wondering if you have thoughts about that.
Yes. And so I've thought about that. Like in our first study, we did ask people to think about them. In some sense, we made them think about certain things. But it's also possible the criticism we had in that first study is it's not, in a sense, it was again a hypothetical. And so that's one of the things I want to think about is our second study suggests that, methodologically, we usually give people hypotheticals. And so a lot of our research is based upon hypotheticals, and we might get different studies if we actually had people think about things that were true. And so that was part of our deception, is that we said that Penn State is considering this, and Penn State was considering it at one point, but not when they fill out the questionnaire. So that's one thing I want to say. But I think that it's also just thinking about what you're saying is that's really kind of one of the earliest things in communication research is, and you're doing advertising, the first thing you need to do is get people's attention. And once you get their attention, then you can start moving on. So that's kind of like the first step in basic marketing, basic persuasion research, was that cognitive processing part. And getting people's attention is really critical. And that's where I was thinking about the interesting thing about the emotional responses of being bored. It's like, whatever. I'm not really interested in this anymore, so I'm not paying attention. But I think the point is that, I guess some of it is that when you are trying to implement a particular policy and people are going to vote on that policy, that is your opportunity to be having messages. And so, so if we're trying to understand those things, we can think about them in terms of the context where people are actually trying to make decisions about policies in their communities, one's referendums. And so you will have some group of people's attention, more so than not. It's not they're going to have great attention to it necessarily, but that is kind of your opportunity at those points. So influencers like that, I guess question to what extent do influencers like the big celebrities could affect attention. So yeah, I think that's the sort of thing. So a lot of the things that try and get people's attention, and I like that one. My suspicion is things, like TikTok, you might get a certain group of people, but in a sense, you get their attention. So go to, in some sense, that when I see that is go to the places that people go to the places where there's trusted sources that people will agree with. But I think this social validation is really important as well. So influencers, who are these influencers who are going to get your attention to pay attention to things? But when I say that, I think there's a danger of getting it. What we've done a lot to try and get people's attention is these fear appeals. And so we have hurricanes happening, we have droughts everywhere, we have forest fires. And so we use that as a way to get people's attention. And that has risk to it in some sense. It appealed to a certain audience and other people will avoid it. Just like fear appeal problems. It's not that they couldn't work, but that's that value framing when you start your message. And so I think it's worth thinking about what sort of attention works and whose attention are you going to get. So so the starting point of persuasion is to get people to pay attention in this massive world where lots of things are trying to get our attention.
Yeah, you've got another question here, Jen. I'll just read it to you. It says, this is from an anonymous attendee. In addition to messaging from policymakers or organizations working to address climate change, individuals may be subject to counter messaging from industry on the same issues or policies. Have you considered looking into how these larger campaigns affect individual perceptions of policies?
Yes, so that's what I meant in terms of like these long-term effects. So this idea of inoculation, that if we get people to the point where they are paying attention and we've given them strong information, I think that's an important part of thinking about this messaging. And so you're going to get people to say something else. And so trying to think about, I guess, again, if you can get people to pay attention to something, and that means that message is going to have to be really good. And it's really then, that gets back to, again, some other classic literature. Do you present a one-sided argument or do you present a two-sided argument? And so that's really old attitude research. And so the dual process models would argue that if it's not relevant to them, the one-sided argument is probably fine. You just go with it and they'll believe it, but it won't necessarily last very long. And so the two-sided argument might be really important when people are paying attention to it. And so not to be afraid of the alternatives arguments, not to be afraid of somebody who's going to be giving a counter message, but recognize that. And then there's a whole thing, how do you do that? And so John Cook's research on countering climate change myths, and what I think about is conspiracy theories. So how do you present a conspiracy theory? And basically you do what a lot of people aren't doing, is you don't start with a conspiracy. You don't say, look, people believe this. Isn't that amazing? They believe this, and this is why they're wrong. That doesn't work as well as if you say, this is what's really true. And look, it doesn't follow. These other people don't quite make sense. Then you go back to your own message. So there's strategies for how to present information that will make it more effective. But I think it's the idea of not shying away from the counter messages. And I guess I'd also say the counter messages are not necessarily oppositional either. I think that we need to be thinking about the counter messages, and in some sense of then how do we make our policy better? And that's the whole political zone. Can we make them in a way where we can move forward? And this would be going really back to stakeholders. So can you get your stakeholders, those are the people for whom are going to be affected by the policies and make decisions by the policies. Can you get them in the same room together, either literally or figuratively, and have building together to create the policies, as opposed to trying to necessarily see somebody else as like the opposition, but to co-create something together.
All right, well, it looks like we are hitting right up against the hour. And so, and you've addressed all the questions that I saw. So,
so if anybody wants to send me any questions, just email me. That'd be great.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time. And this really is this was a great talk and a fascinating set of studies. So thank you for sharing them with us here.
All
For
right,
those
thank
of
you.
you who maybe missed the beginning or you want to see this again, we will be posting it to the Division 34 website as well as our Division 34 YouTube channel in the coming days.
All right, thanks.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.